So, when Games Workshop decides to introduce a new faction for 40k, what is the next most likely choice? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy and tactics focused 40k channel, where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. So Games Workshop has introduced a few fully fledged factions into 40k over the last few years. We've seen full expansions of the Thousand Sons and Death Guard, the realisation of Adeptus Mechanicus and the Adeptus Custodes, as well as Genestealer cults rising from the ashes once again. Going back 10 years, the support for all of these factions were absolute pipe dreams, and in general I think that they're part of Games Workshop's newer approach of actually listening to customer feedback and genuinely trying to make the things that people most want to see happen on the tabletop. New factions mean that they can introduce an entire range of new models for people to buy, as well as be more creative and add more interesting facets to the game. I honestly think it's more of a question of when than if Games Workshop decides to add new factions to 40k. At least over the last few years they seem to be operating by fleshing out an army that's already existent in the background. After all, 40k has an almost limitless amount of possibilities, with stories told about multiple alien races, chaos cults, and various imperial sub-factions that could all potentially see their own army. In this video we'll take a look at some of the various options they might choose to realise next for Imperial Chaos and Xenos, ranging from the more likely to the downright unlikely, and have a talk about the likelihood of each. So without further ado, let's get into it and look at some of their options. So let's focus on the Imperium first. And in general, I think it would be easiest for them to make a new faction out of one of the organisations that's existent in the fluff already, but is mainly only limited to a unit and a datasheet or two, but could reasonably be expanded into an entire army should they want to support it and give it a lot more background. First up we have the Rogue Traders. We saw them release some beautiful new plastics for these guys around the Kill Team release, and it often is their case when they trial a new army and then release it as a full faction further down the line, such as they did with Deathwatch vs Genestealer Cult in the Deathwatch Overkill box. Both Deathwatch and Genestealer cults were released as fairly prescribed, inflexible forces to start with, and then were expanded with more options. I wouldn't say that Rogue Traders and their associated militia are quite as likely a candidate for this to happen to compared with the Deathwatch or Genestealer cult, as they aren't really quite as big a galactic threat, or is able to go toe-to-toe with the other great empires of the 41st millennium. But I don't think it's out of the line of possibility if Games Workshop massively talked up their power in the fluff, much as they have done with Genestealer cults being elevated to a threat that can infest entire planets and star systems. Next up we have Sisters of Silence, and I'll be honest, I strongly suspect that these guys might see an expansion of their range in the near future. We already have rumours of a new Adeptus Custodes Codex coming out soon, and I certainly think it could be possible to include the Sisters of Silence in with this in the Talons of the Emperor. Like the Sisters, the Custodes were basically limited to just one unit for a while, and then had something of a surprise release with those jet bikes and Terminators coming out to support them and turn them into more of a credible army in their own right. I could certainly see this happening for the Sisters of Silence, to fully flesh out the faction and allow making a full army possible, which isn't really an option at the moment when they just have one box of troops available. Next up we have the Adeptus Arbites, the brutal enforcers that we've seen some examples of in Necromunda. These are another faction that's been present in the lore for a very long time, and are fairly well documented, but until we've seen the models in Necromunda they've barely not had any representation on the tabletop. Now they're definitely more of a police force than an actual army, but then so were Custodes. They were more sort of guardians as opposed to an actual fighting force that would go forth across the galaxy, and that changed very rapidly. So not necessarily the most likely in my opinion, but certainly possible, and I'm sure a lot of people would have fun commanding a full force of Riot Shield armed infantry. Next up we have a very outside one, which are the Men of Iron. Warhammer 40k doesn't really go in that much for machine intelligences, aside from relics from the Dark Age of technology. These scary relics of ages past have for the most part been a fully background faction of a threat that was dealt with long ago, but with the appearance of a certain Man of Iron called UR25 in the Blackstone Fortress kit, it's certainly possible that they could go about releasing more if they really wanted to. With the warp the way it is, allowing fleets to turn up millennia after they set off, it could throw everyone a bit of a curveball for a vast force of Men of Iron to appear out of the void and wage brutal war on the galaxy. Very unlikely in the near future in my opinion, but certainly an option that they could go with. Next we have the Legion of the Damned, the spectral unknown space marines that appear unbidden in armour wreathed in flame and vanish just as mysteriously. They're one of the oddities of 40k, and they don't seem to have made the transition into the new Space Marine Codex, and as their kit is pretty old, they haven't really received a lot of support. Again, I don't think that these guys are likely to come back anytime soon, and if they did, I think that we'd see a refresher of their original kit with a new plastic set, as opposed to an entire faction of the force. But if they did want to expand them further, I see no reason why they couldn't be fielding other units or war machines, though this would likely answer some of the mysteries behind the Legion, and in a way it's quite fun having it as an unexplained facet of 40k. Finally, again, if Games Workshop really wanted to, they could expand the scope of some of the existing Space Marine chapters, either some of the first founding chapters, such as Black Templars, which had their own codex for quite a lot of the game now, but were brought into the fold in the main Space Marine Codex in 8th edition. It's not outside of the possibility for them to do this from any of the first founding chapters in Codex Space Marines, or even one of the more notable successor chapters such as Crimson Fists, or maybe even a new chapter such as the All Primaris Silver Templars. In all honesty though, I would be surprised if they went this way, seeing as they do have 3 full Marine chapters in Dark Angels, Blood Angels and Space Wolves, who essentially have very similar armour and abilities to the standard Codex Space Marines, while having their own unique units and rules on top of that. Space Marines already have quite a lot of different ways that you can collect them, and that's not even getting into things like Grey Knights and Deathwatch, who are even more divergent. At least for the present, they seem to have gone down the route of using these supplement books, which has allowed Games Workshop to add a bunch of extra additional rules to these chapters without having to make them have their entire own standalone codex, which is probably a better balanced view in my mind. Finally, I didn't include them on the list, but Militarum Tempestus are also a decent option that could see their own codex again. They did after all have one in 7th edition. So if Games Workshop ever intended to release a few more kits for them, then they could certainly justify them as their own codex once more. Certainly doesn't seem likely in any sort of near future though, as they just got all of their rules expanded a lot in the Psychic Awakening Greater Good book, and that all happened when they were safe within Codex Astra Militarum. Moving on to Chaos now, and some of these in my mind are a lot more likely. First of all, Traitor Guard or the Lost and the Damned are kind of a faction that's been crying out for some official models for a very long time now. Space Marines fall to Chaos, and in all honesty it seems like Guardsmen and Planetary Defence Forces fall to Chaos a lot more easily. They're a faction that's talked about over and over again in the fluff, and are quite a frequent army that I see converted on the tabletop to show that they're representing a traitor force with the standard Astra Militarum rules. Technically, we do already have the Renegades and Heretics rules from Forge World, although they're a little bit all over the place, and they're certainly not very up to date in this edition. I think that this is one of the areas that Games Workshop might choose to swoop in themselves and release them as their own faction, particularly as we've seen some very nice new Traitor Guard models from the Blackstone Fortress sets, including Commissars and Chaos Ogrins, and it does make me wonder if these are sort of trial models for a wider release later on. Certainly nothing's guaranteed, but I think there's at least a reasonable chance that they could be released sometime within a year or so. It just depends on what Games Workshop chooses to devote their energies to. Next up on the Chaos predictions are some fairly safe bets in the Emperor's Children and World Eaters. Both Death Guard and Thousand Sons have both seen their own full releases, acquiring their own unique HQs, redos of their standard Cult Marines, some cultist equivalents, and some nice demon engines for the Death Guard. I see absolutely no reason why World Eaters and the Emperor's Children won't get this as well, to fully flesh out a faction of Slaneshi Marines and Servants of the Blood God. With both the Thousand Sons and with the Death Guard, we got their Primarchs as well, Mortarion for the Death Guard and Magnus for the Thousand Sons. I believe both of them sold very well, particularly Mortarion, so I'd say it's kind of a given that we're going to see Fulgrim and Angron on the table at some stage. This is definitely more of a when than if. If I had to guess, I'd suspect that the Emperor's Children will be next on the list before World Eaters, but to be honest they could certainly go either way. Just because of the amount of time since Death Guard, I'd be surprised if we don't see one of these two within the year, particularly if they release 9th edition at some stage. Now in 7th edition, Games Workshop released Khorne Daemonkin, an interesting way to field both Khorne Space Marines and Khorne Demons together in the same army, with some interesting and fluffy bonuses for doing so. They were quite a fun army with the mechanics that they had back then. They could summon in more demons based on the number of units that died, and they were generally quite a fun army to play with and against, while not being quite as strong as some of the other silliness that was happening in 7th edition. Quite a lot of people enjoyed this way of playing Chaos, and it honestly surprised me that they didn't follow this up with different ones for the different god factions. With the 8th edition ally system in place, and the way that Codexes are being played these days, I'd surprised if we see a return to the Demonkin format, but again it's one of those things that isn't impossible. Dark Angels are always on the hunt for their Chaos Fallen counterparts, and there's certainly Chaos Marines that have cropped up numerous times over the millennia. In some of the more recent Dark Angels background, visions have been seen of an army of fallen gathering under Luther to lead to the downfall of the Dark Angels chapter for good, and at least narratively they seem to be building up to some sort of confrontation of Luther versus the Lion, who's happily sleeping on the Dark Angels rock. At the moment, the fallen kits that you can buy are Cypher, and the Dark Angels veteran kit, painted black and optimistically called Fallen by Games Workshop. This is another faction where I wouldn't be surprised to see an actual dedicated kit that's meant to be Dark Angels who have actually fallen to Chaos, rather than just the same veterans kit but painted a different colour. If we did see a release for them, I suspect it to be at the same time as they reawaken the Lion and make him a model for Warhammer 40k. As I said with my Primarchs video, I'm not really entirely certain as to when that might actually happen, but I suspect it is on the cards for some time in the future and would certainly be a dramatic event to shake up the narrative in 40k. I'm not entirely clear exactly how Fallen would operate too differently to standard Space Marines, so it's interesting to think where they might go with that if they did choose to go down that route. Moving on to Xenos now, and I think that one of the more likely factions that Games Workshop might eventually realise as their own thing again are the Kroot. Their kits are pretty dated at the moment. I know Forge World did release some Narlocks and things for them at one point, before eventually deciding that they didn't want to support the range anymore, presumably because they weren't selling amazingly. But I think they are a faction that people would collect if their range was available, and would certainly provide some interest to Tau Empire, allowing them to have an ally, much in the same manner that Tyranids have acquired Genestealer cults recently. I would strengthen Tau as their own sort of mini-faction, rather than just them. Forge World have kind of already shown how this could be done. In general, people were fairly positive about the various Narlock riders and things, but it is a bit of a question as to how well that would actually be received in terms of people actually wanting to buy them, I guess. Nevertheless, they're probably one of the most notable alien races that doesn't have its own codex. If we were trying to look for a similar faction that could ally to Orcs in the same way that Genestealer cults can with Tyranids, then Games Workshop could conceivably expand the Gretchen as their own faction, particularly as there's plenty of background for rebel grots, defying their Orc oppressors and setting up their own society. We even saw the Red Gobbo released over Christmas, who's very much down with this idea. I've seen various people take time and effort to build up an entire converted rebel grot army, and it's very interesting to see. I think it's a soft sign that when people start converting their own miniatures to represent a faction that isn't really sold by Games Workshop, then there's at least some demand there. Again, as with Kroot and Tau, it's to give the Orcs an ally option, and make the faction feel a bit more fleshed out as a bit more of a super faction, much like Eldar, Imperium and Chaos. Talking of Eldar, there are numerous ways that their range could be expanded. The first and most obvious in my mind are being Inari expanded as an entire full faction, rather than just a few HQ choice, and then just leading some of the same models from Craftworld's Harlequins or Drukhari, but giving them some slightly altered rules. When the Inari first came out, I was honestly expecting them to be backed up by some further faction-specific units, which just haven't materialised over the last few years. I guess Games Workshop will choose to flesh out the faction whenever they feel that there are numerous models within the greater Eldar faction range that could do with a refresh at some point, particularly Aspect Warriors and other fine cast things, so whether or not they ever choose to release any Inari models before fully updating the Eldar line is a big question mark. But again, they're a very logical point to expand if you want to add more Eldar models in there. Other Eldar factions that could be realised are Exodites, much like Rebel Grots. They're an army that I've seen converted multiple times, with various Eldar riding dinosaurs and things, to represent Eldar who are living on their own Exodite worlds, defending them against invaders. It certainly shows that there is some demand if there are people converting them, but it is a bit of a question of just how many people would be wanting to collect more Space Elves, as we arguably already have 4 factions of them if you do count Inari at the moment. Corsairs, much like Kroot, are a retired Forge World range that they did some interesting things in one of the Imperial Armour books with, before not bothering to sell the range anymore, again presumably because it wasn't selling amazingly. Operating somewhere in the line between the more civilised Craft Worlds and the utterly depraved Dark Eldar, these nomads certainly represent a potential credible force in the galaxy. But again, Games Workshop has a lot of options to go down with Space Elves, so they might be quite a way down the list for getting any attention. With Xenos, really the sky is the limit in terms of what they could potentially add in. There are all sorts of races documented within the greater 40k galaxy. Anything from Hrud, Zotes, Squats, Nikazar, Rakgol and Demiurge, and I hope I'm pronouncing all of them right, all of which have a decent amount of lore behind them, and should they really want to, I'm sure could be expanded into a full faction. I think it is just more of a case of resources and priorities though, as whenever Games Workshop creates a release, they do have to weigh it up against creating additional support for the factions they already have, particularly when there's ones that haven't seen updates in a very long time for certain models, and it's starting to show. So, having looked at all of the options, which do I think are the most likely races that might get a new faction update at some point in the future? You probably already guessed some of my opinions from watching this so far, but I think there are probably about 5 that stand out above the rest, and those are Sisters of Silence, Traitor Guard and Legion of the Damned, Emperor's Children, World Eaters, and the Inari. I'm pretty sure that we will certainly see some of those within the next couple of years. In particular, the Chaos ones seem ripe for being released as new factions all of their own. I'll certainly be interested to see what they do with them. Having new options in 40k always makes the game more interesting, as well as seeing new very pretty models on the table. If I've missed anything in terms of factions that we might see expanded, please let me know down below. I'm sure that this isn't a complete list, and it's a very big galaxy after all, but if I've overlooked anything that's blindingly obvious, please let me know. If you've enjoyed the video, please feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. We have new 40k content every single day, mainly of a tactics related nature, though every so often it's fun to do a bit of speculation on the machinations of Games Workshop. If you'd like to support the channel, I do have a Patreon page, which is what helps keep these videos coming, as they do take a very long time to make, and it's what allows me to do it as a bit more of a full-time thing rather than just a hobby in weekends and evenings. So if you're enjoying the content, any support that you can spare is greatly appreciated, and as always, a big thank you to those who are already helping out. In any case though, thank you very much for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.